You could certainly, again, on a simplistic reading, you could say a Lamanite has to be a descendant. But that's your reading. That isn't what the text says.
Yeah, it's
You
not
know,
a
you
careful.
dive into the way the text uses the terminology and how it develops, you can't support that argument. So you could certainly say so and assume so, but you're basing it on an assumptive reading rather than a very careful reading of the text. The text itself does not support that reading. The text.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. In today's episode, I have back with me friend and scholar and researcher of the Book of Mormon, Brant Gardner. Brant, thanks for coming back again.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Always
Yeah,
good to be here.
great to have you on. It's been a few months since we've done the episode, and we've done many different interviews about the Book of Mormon. We've done an episode on Book of Mormon historicity. We talked about convergences in Mesoamerica and things with Mayan culture and the text of the Book of Mormon. We did an episode looking at like the Heartland geography model as well in the Book of Mormon and your view and theory of the translation, it being more of a functional translation. And then we did another interview. Oh, it was responding to John Lundwall. I think that was the last episode we did
Yeah.
back August or September time. So it's been too long. It's been nearly 6 months without Brant Gardner. So I have to bring you back on again.
Well, yeah, it's about time,
It is about time. I think you're probably the guest I've had on the most, so you should feel very special about that.
Well, that's because I'm available.
Well, I do have to say that I have been going through a little bit of a lot. I want to do this interview with you anyway, but any scholars or researchers or apologists on the Book of Mormon, there's some people who have not been getting back to me. So I will chase after those people. I will not name names, but those people who are avoiding to get back to me, you need to repent and come on and be interviewed. But I'm thrilled to have this time to interview you, Brant. And what we're going to talk about in today's episode is we're going to talk about like three main things. And we might split this, I might split this after into separate episodes, but we're going to talk about, does the Book of Mormon allow for and speak of there being other people there other than, the Nephites and the Lamanites? And then we're also going to talk a little about like who are the Lamanites in light of DNA evidence, because one of the purposes of the Book of Mormon is to convert the Lamanites, and a very common criticism is, well, then who are the Lamanites? How do we identify who the Lamanites are? And then we're going to talk a little about racism in the Book of Mormon and some of the different theories or interpretations of the skin of blackness that came upon the Lamanites, and talk about Brant's view. And we're going to discuss maybe some of the theories proposed in the recent video that Book of Mormon, was it Book of Mormon Central or Scripture Central? That Jasmine, she was the one talking in the video. So we'll talk about that as well. But for any listeners who may be new to my channel, who have not watched our previous interviews, in a minute or two, can you explain who you are, your background, your scholarship and research into the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, I can give a quick background. As a Latter-day Saint from birth, I've always known something about the Book of Mormon, and for some reason I got very excited about it on my mission. And I'd read Thomas Stewart Ferguson's One Fold, One Shepherd and thought that was a wonderful book, and have since changed my mind, just in case anybody wonders. But getting back from my mission, I really wanted to learn more about it. And so that kind of piqued my interest. And I went into anthropology and then kind of fell in love with Mesoamerica quite apart from the Book of Mormon. When I started working on Mesoamerica, I had no idea that that there was really going to be a good way to correlate the Book of Mormon with any particular location. And then John Sorensen's book came out. That impressed me, gave me a way to look at it. And then I started, well, I guess I should mention that my career to make a living got completely separated from anthropology. I never earned a professional penny from anthropology. I got a master's degree and it was a wonderful education, and never used it to, as a profession. But as a hobby, as a sidelight, as everything else, it started informing the way that I looked at the Book of Mormon. And then at some point in time, I started writing. And again, anthropology, Mesoamerican anthropology sort of informed it. And I guess as the last sort of introduction, what I decided to do at some one point was to sort of write a long commentary about the Book of Mormon, but to do it from a Mesoamerican perspective, but without sort of laying out the path beforehand. And we're familiar with Elder Uchtdorf's conference talk where he's talking about aircraft and the fact that if you're a degree or two off, you never get to your destination. And what I found absolutely fascinating was that taking that background of Mesoamerica and putting it into the Book of Mormon never got me a degree off. It always fit. And the one time, well, the few times that I kind of thought that things were going to diverge was when I went far ahead and I said, oh, this is how it's going to be when I get there. And it wasn't, but it was tighter with the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerica than I thought it was. So it was an interesting process to go through, but one that convinced me that, first of all, the Book of Mormon is an ancient text that comes from a real people in a real place, and that place was Mesoamerica, not because I could find a beautiful ruin, but because that area informed the text. It made it more understandable. More things sort of came to light. And so that background, putting that Mesoamerican background behind it, all of a sudden made the text work better than without it. And I think that's, my greatest testimony of why I'm interested in Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon. It makes the Book of Mormon more interesting and more logical and more human.
Right. And in our
While
previous
still being
episodes,
divine, by the way.
sorry, what was that?
While still being divine. I don't want to give the impression that I think it's a totally human fabrication. I mean,
Right.
real people wrote these things, real humans did, and they lived at a particular time, and their times influenced them just as our times influence us.
Right. And I think one of the main things that you emphasized in your book is that often I think in the past people have been looking to find the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, and your book and your scholarship and your research is showing, can we see Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon? Can we see things which correlate
Yeah,
and converge with Mayan culture or the civilizations or the geography and time, place, and location? And that's almost like a different approach. But it
yeah,
was really interesting for me reading through your book and our past conversations, seeing some of the things which I hadn't noticed before in the Book of Mormon, and some things which fit very well with Mesoamerica, the geology, the rise and fall of the civilizations, things in Mayan culture, which really enriches it. But one thing that you also talked about was understanding that the Nephites and the Lamanites and also the Jaredites, that they weren't the Mayas or the Olmec, but that they were sort of among or participate in that
yeah.
civilization, in that culture. Maybe you could talk
And I
about that.
think, yeah, that's important, I think, for everybody to understand. And the easiest way to understand it is all of us who are Latter-day Saints live in a culture. There is no government, there's no secular government for the Latter-day Saints. We all live inside some country somewhere. And yet we're Latter-day Saints. The clothes that we wear, the cars that we drive, the pots that we cook in have nothing to do with Latter-day Saints. It's the people that we're around. The style of house we live in is dictated by the style that everybody else is, even though there's only going to be one of us and 50, 60, 100 people living in this, community. Our houses are all going to look somewhat similar because there isn't, a unique LDS style of home. And that's what happens in Mesoamerica. These people lived there, but they were influenced by the material culture. And so when someone says, oh, I can't find a Nephite artifact, well, we don't find Nephite artifacts because there's nothing on them that's written that says this was a Nephite artifact. On the other hand, there isn't any artifact that has written on it that says this is a Maya artifact. There is a culture area, and we assign that name to that set of cultural traits and cultural material traits.
Yeah, because my understanding that the terms Maya the Maya and the Olmec, that was given by archaeologists. That's not what they called themselves anciently.
Yeah,
They
pretty much. Yeah, I mean, we use Maya as a very generic term for this large group of people. And if you went to any one of them and said, who are you? They identified themselves by the city they were in. And I was talking to one person, I can't remember who it is, but an anthropologist, I believe, was talking about going to this one particular town of Maya, and they spoke a particular dialect of Maya. And another town not too far away um, spoke the same language. And the guy says something about the two being the same. They said, "Oh no, we're very different. This is our city, that's their city. We're not the same people at all." So they speak the same language, have the same basic culture, but no, we're this town. This is us. And that's very common in the ancient world. They're going to associate themselves by their city, even though they speak the same language as their enemy city, which in one very important case in Mesoamerica, Tikal and Calakmul, they're like 30 kilometers apart. And there are 3-day walk between them. So, you walk a day and a half and you're at your border. And you walk a little bit further, and now you're in your enemy's territory. The enemy you fight with. You're just constantly at war with them, and they're that close. But they certainly don't consider themselves the same.
right.
But from an archaeological historical standpoint, we stand back and call them both Maya.
Right. And science and archaeology would say that there were people, there were civilizations here in the Americas, before the Nephites would have arrived. And your view would be that that there obviously was the Olmec civilization before the Jaredites came, and there was the Mayan civilization before the Nephites arrived. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. And,
So
and that sort of goes to the question that you wanted to talk about, which is, this idea of, were there people here?
yes.
And I think that's something that we should kind of flesh out. So I'm obviously older than you are,
Really?
and I remember,
Never guessed.
yeah, I remember being in grade school and thinking when they talked about all these people who came and got across the Bering Strait, I remember thinking, oh no, I know better. They didn't do that. It was all Book of Mormon people. Nobody was here. And this is the way I grew up. This is what I was taught. Um, because there wasn't a lot of knowledge about these things. And so uh, the standard Sunday school teaching was Book of Mormon didn't mention anybody else specifically, and so therefore nobody was here. So I kind of grew up that way. And what that means is that other people not only have, but might still believe that. And so we have this interesting question of, how does the text fit against what we know?
By
So
history.
let's start with, what this text of the Book of Mormon. Does the Book of Mormon explicitly tell us that there was somebody else here? No, does not. Okay. Why not? Well, we start the Book of Mormon with Nephi. We don't start it with Mormon's book. We start it with Nephi, which is in the small plates, which we get because the beginning of Mormon's book had been lost.
Hmm.
But this isn't the first thing that Nephi wrote. This is a later reminiscence that he wrote for. It's almost political, but it's religious political. It's kind of mixed up. It's First Nephi is his justification for being the ruler over his brothers and being able to be the leader of a community. And that's why he's writing it. So when he gets to the New World, he doesn't mention people because that isn't part of the story. It's not important. Um, what's important is that he becomes the ruler over these people. Would he have mentioned it in the large plates? Quite possibly. Do we have any way of knowing that? No, there's no way to know. We might have got that if Mormon had mentioned that. So if in the 116 pages that had been lost, would maybe Mormon mention that? but probably not, because that was 1,000 years before, and it wasn't the story Mormon was telling. So Mormon didn't care. So the people who remembered things that came from those lost pages never said anything about meeting someone. Highly likely that, Mormon didn't do it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't in the large plates. We just have an absence. And of course, it's that aphorism, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, or however that goes. The question is, what do we do with that? Is that the only thing we can do? And anytime you're dealing with an ancient text, one of the things you have to do is look at the entirety of the text rather than the sort of explicit things. You look at
Almost
the
looking for
corners.
some implicit references, like reading between
Yeah,
the lines. Because
you,
I
you,
remember
you look
whenever
in the
I,
corners where things are hiding that you're not looking at.
yeah, like for example, whenever I did an episode on DNA and the Book of Mormon, this is going back, I
Yeah,
think June, July time, so I can't fully remember everything that I researched, but I remember really the crux of the DNA problem comes down to does the Book of Mormon allow for there being other people? Because if the Book of Mormon explicitly says that they were the only people that came to this land, that it was uninhabited, and
yeah,
that all Native Americans descend from Laman and Lemuel, then I think you could view that DNA disproves the Book of Mormon. But if they came to a continent where there are already civilizations and peoples here, and it was
yeah,
Lehi's family of around 30 people, and there was thousands of people around, then even critics, I remember reading a quote from Simon Southerton, even acknowledged that, yeah, after a few generations, we wouldn't see trace of their DNA. But the
right.
argument is, but the Book of Mormon doesn't speak about there being other peoples. And I realized whenever I was researching this, I was like, okay, because if a small group of like 30, 40 Israelites came to a place where there was already thousands of people, after a few generations with all the mixing, there wouldn't be trace of their DNA. So it really comes down to, does the Book of Mormon allow for their being? Does it speak about other people?
Right. And let's do a couple of things here. And, just before we start on that part of the Book of Mormon, let's assume that what we're talking about is real people. Real people have to move. Real people have to come across the ocean. Real people have to figure out how to live when you come into a new area. And if we look at real people and archaeological evidence, et cetera, the first thing that we learn is, of course, there were people here. All of the archaeological evidence says, yeah, there were people here. Anytime the Book of Mormon had someone show up, somebody was here. Um, so archaeologically, we know that that happened. The question for the truth claim of the Book of Mormon is, does the Book of Mormon contradict that by
Exactly.
saying that it was empty? Well, let's do a couple of things. And the first one is, if it's a real people and you come across the ocean and the land is empty, okay, let's start with that premise. If the Book of Mormon said there was nobody here and you had 30 people come across, realistically, what would have happened? They would have died out. They would not have survived. You get 30 people who come across where the parents, the Lehi and Sariah are both, if not upper class, certainly upper middle class. I mean, lower upper class. These are people who were pretty well off when they left Jerusalem. They weren't people who were struggling. They also weren't farmers. He was a metallurgist. And I would say you could take any number of the people that you and I both know and say, go out on the land and farm and, eat what you grow. We would die.
Yeah, wouldn't last very long.
I have no idea what to do. And so these are people who are coming across who don't have very many talents to start up, a new civilization. And if you've only got 30 of them, which plants will kill you? If you tried to eat this, will you die? I don't know. You try it first.
Hmm.
Uh, you know,
I know a
30
critic
people
would
just aren't going
probably
to make it.
think, obviously, they would think like, yes, you're talking about like realistically, would a group of 30 people
Realistically,
who came to a continent like historically, would they
Yeah.
survive? They might think, well, if this is just, a fictional text created from Joseph Smith, then he wouldn't have thought these
And so
things through.
that's the next question, okay? If we're first of all dealing with realities, the
Mhm.
first reality is we know people were there. The second reality is if we pretended there were not, you wouldn't have a Book of Mormon story because they wouldn't have lived. So the entire real construction of the world tells us that the Book of Mormon had to have taken place in an area where somebody else already was. So with that, you look at the text of the Book of Mormon and you say, are there places hiding in the text that tell us that there were other people here without explicitly saying it? Okay. Now, one of them that is totally implied is the fact that they survived and multiplied quickly. Very, very quickly after the Lamanites and the Nephites split. It's not long after that that Nephi is saying, and there were many more Lamanites than there were Nephites. Lots more
Yes.
Lamanites.
Which you might wonder if they were around a similar size party when they divided. And
Yeah, I
Jacob
mean,
isn't that many
call it, you
years from when
start
they
with
first
30 and
arrived.
you divide 15 to 15. How come these guys are that much more fertile that fast? Not to mention the fact that if you've only got 30 people coming here and they're all family, it's all incest, folks. And
Yeah.
that's not very fun to think about. Um, so the implication that they developed that rapidly, uh, again, tells us that they had to have mixed with another population. Well, what else do we find? The most explicit one is in 2 Nephi 5, where they're splitting. And Nephi is talking about who leaves. And he pretty much names everybody that we can think of. And, here's the people that go with me. And he even names two of his sisters. It's the first time we find out he has sisters.
Right,
I
because
say
they're not mentioned
two.
in
We
First
find out he
Nephi.
has sisters. We don't know how many.
Yeah.
So at least two. Um, and we hadn't heard of them before, but obviously, they came from somewhere.
Mm.
But he names pretty much everybody that we could think of. And we know that Laman and Lemuel stay there and their family stays there. And it's like everybody that we know about is accounted for. And at the end of that, he says, and everyone else who would go with me. Well, who was everybody else? There's nobody else. If they're alone in the world, there's no one else to go with him. So this is one of those places where you say, the text is telling me that there were other people there, even when they aren't saying explicitly they're there. They're there. They just show up in the text naturally because they really are there. And so you account for them. But it's not something where you're saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to talk about, what it was like when we first met them. That's interesting to us. Clearly was not interesting to Nephi, and I doubt it was interesting to Mormon. But again, large plates, probably. Um,
Okay,
Now,
so
what
that's
happens
two
after that?
implicit references. So one, you said about the population growth in the Lamanites, the population of
Yeah,
the Lamanites being much larger than the Nephites, only after what was this, after about 50 so years
yeah,
of them being in the
30,
promised land?
30 years or so after
Yeah,
arriving in the New World. Yeah.
which doesn't really make sense. And
We don't
also
know
like
how
the
long after the
Lamanites,
split.
and how long after when they arrive do like the wars begin between like Nephites and the Lamanites? Because I feel like
Yeah.
it'd be hard for that to happen if
Nephi talks about having had wars, and I suspect the word wars is, even at that point in time, I think war is skirmishes, raids. I think
right.
incidents would probably be better than wars, although as a translation, war is probably as good as anything else. But when we think of war, we think of these massive movements of large populations of warriors. And I doubt that was happening that early. We
At
don't
this point, would
really
you have seen
see
their
that.
communities be more like sort of like
Yeah.
villages, tribes, not quite huge cities?
Yeah. I suspect that's what it is, just because that entire region doesn't have that kind of population or governmental um, capability of putting, a large army in the field.
Hmm.
But certainly there was conflict. and enough conflict that in order to have human beings are always in conflict. It really doesn't matter the size. Well,
Right.
unfortunately, we'll fight anybody for who knows what reason.
I can attest that because I work with children and they'll fight over nothing.
Yeah, and
So getting back
sadly,
to
yeah,
the large population of the Lamanites, you would infer from the text that their population being much bigger than the Nephites was from intermixing with either
yes,
natives or indigenous people that
yeah.
were there.
And I think the place where it becomes, for me, most clear that there was an influx of native population in with uh, the immigrants. So Nephi and his clan, the people who came with him, um, he clearly becomes the leader of a new community. But as the leader who is later at least appointed to be king, he tells his brother to give a particular sermon. And he says, okay, Jacob, I want you to give this sermon. And so here is a king saying, you're going to give this sermon. And Nephi basically says, and you're going to give it on these texts of Isaiah. Now we read that, we go, okay, yeah, it's Nephi. He's going to do Isaiah. Of course, Nephi is going to do Isaiah. But what he selects is a very interesting part of Isaiah, which talks about how the Gentiles are going to be the salvation of Israel.
Hmm.
Well, that's an interesting text. And, we can read that text from our perspective and we read it and we say, well, the Gentiles, after Christianity expands to the Gentiles have the gospel and they're the salvation of the covenant. And well, that's, 2,000 years away, at least 1,000 for the people that are being taught this. And it's always interesting to know what you might have to worry about 1,000 years from now, but it's not something you really pay a lot of attention to. If someone tells you, in 1,000 years, things may not be as good, or in 1,000 years, there's going to be a figure here who's going to be really important. Okay, that's nice. I still got to get up and work in the morning. I've got to do what I have to do. What happens 1,000 years from now? You know how long I'm going to be
Irrelevant.
dead for 1,000 years? It makes no sense. And yet, here's the king who points to his brother and specifically says, teach this. You got to assume that this has some relevance to the people that are listening to it. It has to have some immediate impact. Well, what immediate impact would it have? Well, who would the Gentiles be? Well, the non-Israelites
Mhm.
that merged with them. And what is the message? And the message is don't shun them. They're your saviors in this world. Without them, you're not going to make it. So unify your society. They are helping you. They're bringing you in. And you read that and you go, oh yeah, yeah. There's why you would do that. You're going to preach to this mixed community that they need to be unified, and that these people who are not born in the covenant, if you will, are your salvation. You're coming in on their shoulders. All of a sudden, that makes some sense, but it only makes sense in that condition. Other than that, it's Joseph Smith didn't have anything else to do, so he stuck in some chapters of Isaiah.
Right.
But if it's a real people and they were listening to this, the reasoning is because there were people here and they needed to be integrated. Um,
Interesting.
so I think the text, when you look at it, and how soon wars crop up, how many people are fighting, what the population is, all of those things. And in fact, for me, the very fact that early on, even in the city of Nephi, where they have to have a king, you got to have a certain population to even pretend that you have a king. If you got 25 people, calling one of them a king is presumptuous and probably insulting. So you've got to have a population there. So if you read the text and say that this text was written by real people, they may not have written things that we would have liked them to write. But if you read what they did write, you can read between the lines and say, yeah, very clearly there were other people here. They merged with these other people. They had some internal conflicts because of that merge, but they established themselves as a separate people. So I think that's where things go. Historically, we know there were people here, and the text of the Book of Mormon, even though it isn't explicit,
Hmm.
implicitly shows that there were other people here. The people who wrote that text knew about other people.
So before I move on to questions challenging that viewer position, I think a couple of implicit references that I've came across in my research. I think some of this is also in your book as well. So, for example, when Jacob is giving his sermon to the Nephites and sort of rebuking them for having many wives and concubines, but also costly apparel, and concubines is most likely foreign women that they were taking as well, and the implicit reference of costly apparel that you point out to me is that they would have had to have been trading with other peoples there. If
Yeah,
they were just one community, then how could some people have more costly apparel than
yeah,
others? Which is sort of like an implicit reference to like other people being there that they're taking as foreign wives or concubines, but also trading.
and we need to explain that just briefly for those who look at costly apparel, because we all know what costly apparel is. We go into a store and the thing is, $400 or $500 for whatever it is. That's costly. Okay. If I'm going to buy a jacket for $400 or $500, oh man, that's costly. So we have this image in mind that costly means that it just costs a lot of money. In the ancient world where you're making your own clothing, where you don't go to the store to buy it, if you and everybody else in your community is making clothing, what happens? Well, you get a style that people will use, and somebody may innovate something, but if it's really cool, it gets copied. And so it's really hard to have costly apparel in an ancient setting because you're making your own clothing and you're making it with the materials, and everybody around you has the same access to everything that you're using. So you can't have costly apparel. There's no market. The only way you get costly apparel is when there's a differential. Well, how do you get a differential? It's trade. You trade with some other community that has done something different and you bring it in. And particularly if you can bring something in that you can't get locally, that becomes costly apparel. So in ancient cultures, you'll see seashells that get traded far, far inland because they can become decorative, and because they're scarce, therefore they're costly. And so when they're talking about costly apparel, they're talking about trade connections, because that's the only way you can get something that somebody else doesn't have. And in the Book of Mormon, costly apparel is always equated with social strata, where it says, I'm better than you are because I have this. I
Right.
can show you I'm more wealthy because I have this. And one of the comments that I distinctly remember, and I know I put it in the book, is that in Mesoamerica, people wore their wealth.
I find that so interesting whenever I read
Yeah,
that in the book.
yeah, I mean, so yeah, what is costly apparel? Well, the Maya wore their wealth. They showed you
Like
how wealthy
ornaments and
they were by
jewelry.
what they wore, by their costly apparel.
Right.
Uh, so all of that again fits. And as you said, the implication is that you have to have somebody to trade with who is different from who you are. So that means there's got to be a lot of other people here and a lot of connections.
Right. And a couple others I thought of. One is, and this is again in Jacob, so early on in the Book of Mormon, when Sherem, who is, labeled sort of like an antichrist, comes, to the Nephites, and, he talks about like coming from afar to come speak to them, and he's expert in the language of the Nephites, which seems like a strange thing for him to say if he
Yeah.
is a Nephite or if he's a Lamanite, which could be an implicit reference to like, did he come from another, tribe or village that didn't speak the same language?
Yeah. that implication, I think, works best when you already accept that it's there, and then you can say, "Oh yeah, this is just confirmation."
Yeah,
I've
sure.
seen other explanations where it's uh, expert in the language doesn't mean I'm a foreigner who learned your language. It means I'm fluent in the language and I can flatter you. I'm a good speaker. Um, but if you look at that again and you say there are other people there,
Mm,
that's the better interpretation.
right. Yeah, it's maybe not the
And that
strongest
happens, I
argument in
think, with
favor.
a lot of things in the Book of Mormon, where you say, "Oh, can you prove this?" Well, no. But can you demonstrate how it fits together? And that's where this concept of convergence is, where all the little pieces start fitting together, and you get the model where any given piece doesn't necessarily look like the final product, but you start putting them all together. Um, think of a jigsaw puzzle. Any single piece doesn't necessarily look like the entire puzzle, but when you put the whole thing together, then you can see the picture. Um, and if you had pieces from 25 different puzzles, they wouldn't go together. It wouldn't work.
Right.
You couldn't make a picture out of it because all of the pieces do not fit. Um, and I think that's one of the things that, again, going back to what I was saying about Mesoamerica informing the Book of Mormon, um, the pieces fit. Whenever you find this new piece, you go, "Oh yeah, that fits." They find new findings in Mesoamerica, and they get more information about the Maya cultures and what was happening, and you go, "Yeah, that fits. That continues to support the Book of Mormon." I don't know of anything that they've found in Mesoamerica where they dig the whole thing up or they dig the city up and they go, "Oh, man, yep, there it goes. Theory's out. It doesn't fit anymore." It hasn't happened. And when you
Right.
think about that, a book that was published in 1830 in upstate New York should not be able to withstand archaeology, not for a couple of hundred years. It just shouldn't be able to happen, and it has.
I think as well, with the Mulekites as well, because it talks about the Mulekites when they came over to the Promised Land, that they lost their language, and
Mm,
you would view that as so they were found by the Nephites in Zarahemla. It's been a few hundred years. But you kind of think like
yeah,
if they came to an empty continent, how did the Mulekites like lose their language? But you would view it as they came to where there was
yeah.
already people there. I
Well,
think
again,
it's
as
okay speaking
speakers of
Olmec were
English,
there.
yeah, I mean, as speakers of English, we know that, and it's changed a little bit because of communications, but you look at speakers of English, and the English spoken in the UK has differences from what I speak from the United States. And there are also differences from Australia.
Yep.
And we may disagree on what a bonnet is. But other than that, we can communicate with each other.
Yep.
Very clearly, you and I have a different accent in our languages.
Maybe not the
We can
Scottish. Don't know if we can
communicate.
communicate with them.
Yeah,
The
and
Welsh.
so languages just don't change that rapidly where it's mutually unintelligible in 400 years.
Yeah.
Uh, so yes, it's somebody, how do you lose a language that fast when it's mutually unintelligible? You merge with another people and you go with the language of the larger population. And the larger population tends to dominate the language. And again, go back to English. We have a lot of words in French because England was dominated by French speakers for a long time. So we have a lot of loan words in English, but we don't speak French. We speak English with a lot of loan words from French.
Right.
Uh, and that's the kind of thing that you would expect. The Mulekites, might have picked up something here and there. To totally lose their language, you've got to go with the dominant language and say, "Yeah, I'm just going to start speaking that language."
So you would say that the Book of Mormon doesn't make sense as a history unless they were intermixing and interacting with populations and peoples and civilizations that were already there. If the Book of Mormon clearly claimed that they came to an empty continent, promised land with no other peoples there, a lot of these things wouldn't make sense
Right.
historically.
And the fact that it doesn't mention meeting someone is a fact. But all of these other things imply that they met someone. And if, again, you're talking about someone who is artificially writing this, just sitting back in upstate New York in 1830, writing something off the top of their head, in these nooks and crannies, the little places where you're not paying attention, it just wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't think of putting that in. You might talk. Well, we have what's the book I'm thinking of? The Spalding manuscript that until it was found, people thought might be a precursor of the Book of Mormon. You read through that thing and you can tell that it's a novel that is designed to talk about two cultures because it talks a lot about meeting them and what people were like and what they wore and what differences there are, because those are things that are interesting in a story, and they're totally absent in the Book of Mormon. It's because the Book of Mormon is written for a totally different reason. It wasn't there to entertain. It was there this is the history. It has its own purpose. And you have to start looking deeper than the surface to be able to see how these pieces fit. But when you look there, they fit.
So before I bring up a couple of scriptures and arguments that critics would bring up, pushing back or challenging this,
Okay.
I've heard you say before that the Book of Mormon is an ethnocentric record,
Yes.
and while
Yes.
it does contain history, that's not the primary purpose. Could you maybe expound a little bit upon that? This may be you theorizing, but what's sort of like your view as to why they're not mentioning, the
Yeah.
Mayanite or these other ites other than, like the
Yeah.
Lamanites or Ishmaelites or Lamanites?
An ethnocentric record is one that says, I am worried about us. I'm not worried about anybody else. And there is a definition that you wanted to talk about, and we'll just touch on this and maybe get more in depth later. But Jacob says, as early as Jacob, he says, I'm going to call Nephites everybody who is us, and I'm going to call Lamanites everybody else. So he says, yeah, there's all these Jacobites and Josephites and everything else. Don't worry about that. I'm just going to talk about Lamanites and Nephites. And he said, Nephites are us, Lamanites are everybody else. And that's the definition. And that's a very ethnocentric thing to do, to say, yeah, I'm only going to talk about us. And there's this whole world out there of other people. And, I'm not going to be too concerned about them. And it would be very much like the term Jew and Gentile. Who is a Gentile? If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. Is a Roman a Gentile? Is a Greek a Gentile? Is someone from Gaul a Gentile? Yes, all of the above. But they don't make the distinction. And the Book of Mormon is like that. Everybody's a Lamanite. They're not making the distinction. They're just saying, yeah, I'm concerned about this history, and then Lamanites are everybody else.
Right. Okay. I want to come back to that, but I
Yeah.
want to bring up a couple of scriptures or arguments that critics would use to push back on there being implicit references in the Book of Mormon, allowing for there being
Sure.
other people. So the most common one is 2 Nephi chapter 1, and I'm just going to read what it says, what I have highlighted. So it's verse 8 and 9. It says, "It is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations, for behold, many nations would overrun the land, that there be no place for an inheritance." And the key line that a critic might use is this part where it says, "They shall be kept from all other nations, that they may possess this land unto themselves." And I bolded that somebody might
Right.
read that and say that they're being kept from the knowledge of other nations, which it kind of depends how you interpret that, but that other nations won't be coming over or be there, and that they possess this land unto themselves, that they have this empty land to themselves. What is your response? What is your interpretation from that verse?
There's two, I think. And the first would be to remember this is Nephi writing it, and Nephi has had a vision, a very expansive vision of sort of the end of the world and world history. And part of the vision talks about a time when the continent would no longer be kept from other nations, and other nations, the mother of the Gentiles, other nations do come and they do overrun. So Nephi has a prophetic vision that does understand that there will be a time when other nations will come. So if you're going to read other nations as completely foreign, he's saying, yeah, it's being kept from the old world, so the old world doesn't come over here and overrun you, like is going to happen somewhere in the future, because he knows that's going to happen.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
the other thing is, do you read nations as other, old world, or are other nations here? Do you have other nations that are around you? Um, Now, you keep yourselves kind of separate so that nobody else is there. You sort of like, I'm not going to bother you. But, which other nation might overrun them? And there are nations around them that might do that. And the end of the Nephites probably comes when another nation that gets involved. So a lot of this is the promise of the land as well, which is if you keep the promise, you'll prosper in the land. You won't be overrun. So I think that promise and that statement go together. Uh, but if you really want to read nations as somebody foreign, then I think you have to look to Nephi's vision, and remember it's the same guy writing this that had the vision.
Right. And where it says about them possessing this land unto themselves, how do you interpret that?
Again, depends on which epic you're talking about. If you're talking about when they come from the old world, pretty clearly everybody who came from the old world possessed it for themselves, and the United States has a very bloody history of pushing Native Americans off and pretending that they weren't even there. And one of the things that oddly enough happens in early history, in the early history of the United States, is they talked about coming to an empty land. There's
Okay.
Native Americans all over the land, but they thought it was empty. So their literature will talk about them coming to an empty land and conquering an empty land. Um, they just don't happen to mention that the Native Americans were here first. They didn't count.
Right.
So this whole idea of coming to an empty land is almost a literary trope more than a reality anywhere.
And do you think the Nephites as well, well, I think this is coming from Lehi, if I'm remembering second Nephi one, but this is Nephi's record, that they wouldn't have seen like large cities or civilizations at this time where they were in your view, Sorensen's model in Highland,
Um,
Guatemala.
I don't know how large the cities were. They were certainly starting to get reasonable size, and you're going to have some that are already building with stone rather than just villages. Um, so there's a lot of different people around, but whether or not you call them a nation yet, I don't know. That was one of the other reasons why I was talking about the difference between warfare and skirmishes. Uh, it's usually a definition of scale, and they may not have had scale sufficient to call it a war, even though there were conflicts and skirmishes.
Okay. And the last scripture I have is on this topic is Jacob 1 verse 13. And it says, now the people were not Lamanites, or sorry, what was it? Now the people which were not Lamanites were Nephites. Nevertheless, they were called Nephites, Jacobites, Josephites, Zoramites, Lamanites, Lemuelites, and Ishmaelites. But then Jacob says, I will not distinguish them by these names hereafter, but I shall call them Lamanites that seek
Yeah,
to destroy the people of Nephi, and those who are friendly I shall call Nephites, or the people of Nephi. And a question I have based on this verse, so it talks about like the Nephites, what makes up the Nephites is like descendants of Nephi, Jacob, Joseph, Zoram, and then under the Lamanites, you've got like the Lemuelites and Ishmaelites. And the question I had is, why is there no mention of like, Mayanite or whatever the locals call themselves,
yeah, yeah,
ites? It seems that the people that the Book of Mormon are referring to as Nephi or Lamanite are those who came with Nephi to the promised land, Ishmael or Laman's descendants, or but then they were just lumped into
yeah.
Nephi or Lamanite. So that was sort of a question I had. Do you have a thought on that or response?
Oh, I was going to say that what Jacob is doing is saying that there are these tribal divisions. We keep the tribal distinctions,
Hmm.
and that's certainly not surprising. We will see that throughout the Book of Mormon, even before the time of Christ, before Christ's resurrection. The Nephites were going to be dissolved into tribes. Well, how do you dissolve into tribes? Well, the tribes were already there. That was already part of the organizational functioning of the society. So yeah, what Jacob is saying, yeah, we do have these tribes. They continue. So the ones that we've told you about this history, we've still got them, but don't worry about them anymore. Now when we talk about Nephites and Lamanites, it's a different definition. But he's simply saying, yeah, we still have all of these distinctions, just we're going to change the way we call things.
Right. Okay.
But yeah,
Um,
he has no more reason to add someone else in because this is their story. It goes back to the ethnocentrism. This is us. Everybody is being and if you think of it as like the covenant of Abraham, they're being adopted into it for those who are in the community. So they're being adopted into the line. They're not treated any differently.
right. So I think next we'll talk a little about who are the Lamanites. So
Yeah,
before we get into the criticisms and the church in its introduction to the Book of Mormon, and this wasn't on the plates. I believe this was written by Bruce R. McConkie, maybe back in the 80s or something. But it talked about that the Native Americans, that the Lamanites are the
yeah.
principal ancestors of the American Indians or Native Americans, however it words it. And that's been changed to them being among the principal ancestors, which perhaps is a response to DNA evidence.
Oh, I'm sure it
But
is.
yeah, and the view I would have had growing up, I had a very simplistic, you could say, shallow view of the Book of Mormon. So I viewed it as hemispheric. Land northward, that's North America. Land southward, South America, narrow neck of land. Didn't look too carefully at the distances traveled or any other geography models.
You were in good
Again,
company.
yep, I assumed that the Nephites and Lamanites, that they populated the entire continent. They filled from north to
Yeah,
south. They're the only people here. I would have believed that all Native Americans descended from Laman and Lemuel and would therefore have Israelite
yep.
DNA. So before I get into the criticisms that critics would bring up challenging this, what does the Book of Mormon say about the Lamanites? Obviously, I think the descendants of Laman and Lemuel are described as being, Lamanites, but does the Book of Mormon have a more broad use of the term Lamanite? And this might link with what you're saying about sort of like Jew and Gentile
Yeah, and,
scholars.
and it's actually, and this is personal reading of the text. So I won't say this is what, well, scholars agree on this. I'm not sure that they would all agree, but I'll give you my opinion. So as long as everybody understands that this is my
This is
opinion.
your view. This is not
Yeah, the one that we
official
can
doctrine or
easily root in the scripture is when Jacob is saying, there's Nephites and anybody who's against us is a Lamanite. If you aren't a Nephite, you're a Lamanite.
yeah.
Now, what I find absolutely fascinating is that we have, after the time of Christ, in Fourth Nephi, period of 200 years where everything is rosy, everything is great,
Peace, no contention, no wars.
no contentions and no ites.
Yes,
So
that's
there
right.
aren't
No
any
ites.
Nephites and there aren't any Lamanites. Okay, no Nephites, no Lamanites. You get everybody who is in this region converted, and you're at Bountiful, and who knows where after. Says everybody on the face, everybody in the whole face of the land was converted. Uh, which again, as an historical reference, that doesn't mean everybody. It just means everybody we know, because you just can't travel that far, or typically don't, or don't care to be that accurate. Um, but all of a sudden, we get Nephites and Lamanites. How do we get Nephites and Lamanites if there are no ites? If you get them all mixed together,
Hmm.
and there's no distinction whatsoever. And you remember when we have a converted Lamanite, um, in the first case where we have them, the anti-Nephi Lehites are no longer anti-Nephi Lehites. They're Ammonites. They become Nephites.
Yes.
So once you're converted, you're a Nephite. So the definition of Nephite and Lamanite begins to shift, and Nephite begins to mean those who follow the Nephite religion. And of course, religion and politics are mixed up. But basically, if you want to say New World Christian, Nephite, New World Christian are pretty much the same thing. They no longer have any relationship to designation of tribes or anything else because they're coming on the heels of a time when there are no ites. Now, there are tribes and everybody else is there, but that's not the definition anymore. The definition is much broader. And so you become a Nephite. And how do you become a Nephite? Well, if there's no ites, how do you decide which ite you're going to be? Well, I suspect, and again, personal opinion, I really think Mormon is the one who made sure that there were Lamanites or Nephites and Lamanites. I think it's Mormon's construction. We have Nephi, the third Nephi, who is the apostle who is writing most of the account of Christ, appears to become the king, and I think he's the one that's fourth Nephi is named for. I don't think there is, a separate individual named for Nephi. I don't think you can support that. So I think this third Nephi, the same guy who's the apostle, I think he becomes the king. Well, why is his name Nephi? Did we get lucky? What if his name had been Ralph? Would we have, had Ralphites at that point in time? And we don't. We have Nephites, and I think it's because Mormon makes sure we have Nephites. The story has to continue, so we have to have Nephites. Similarly, we have to have Lamanites. And who is a Lamanite? Everybody else. I don't care who you are. You could have been a Nephite, 100 years ago, you could have been a lineal Nephite, but now you're a Lamanite because you don't follow the religion. So it's no longer
literal blood descendants.
Yeah, you can create tribes and you can say we've got these tribes, but by the time you get to the end of the 400 years or the 200 years in fourth Nephi, both Nephi and Lamanite are artificial constructions. They don't refer to lineage at all. And so who are Lamanites? Well, who did Mormon write the Book of Mormon to? He wrote it to Lamanites. So who did Mormon think the Lamanites were? Well, he knew that the Lamanites were anybody who survived the Nephites. They could have been Nephites who, apostatized or got smart enough to say, I don't think I'm going to die on Cumorah. I think I'll go somewhere else and see if I can just live. So, who knows? But for Mormon, it was anybody who was left. He never made a distinction. Mormon makes distinction between Lamanites and Gadiantans, but he doesn't make a Lamanite-Gadianton distinction when he writes to them. So he writes to future Lamanites, and future Lamanites are the people who are here who are not yet converted to the gospel. So when you take that definition and you say, how does, the church deal with it? Well, very early on, obviously, Joseph Smith and all of the early brethren believed that the Native Americans on the Western frontier were all Lamanites. Of course they did. Were they right? Yeah, of course they are, because it's a generic construction. These are people from pre-contact times, people who have survived. Excuse me, and they're not members of the church. They don't believe in the Nephite religion. So yeah, they're Lamanites. Those were the Lamanites for a long time, and Armand Moss has some really good historical work on how the church sort of re-envisioned Lamanites when they realized that the Lamanites that they were finding in North America weren't being converted like the Book of Mormon said they would. But all of a sudden, when you took the Book of Mormon down to Mexico and Central America, and of course then after that into South America, all of a sudden lots of people are joining the church, and they're going, well, wait a minute. These Native Americans along the Mississippi aren't doing what the Book of Mormon said they would do if we gave them a Book of Mormon. But these other people down there, well, they must be Lamanites. And so the Lamanite term, as the church is using it, has become extremely expansive, and it again means probably what Mormon meant. People who were left, who were part of that native culture before conquest, those who remained and who had not received the gospel, those are Lamanites. It's
And
very,
some
very generic.
verses that I found in the Book of Mormon, I have some bullet points that those who fight against the Nephites are labeled as Lamanites. Those who mix
Yeah,
their seed with the Lamanites are then labeled as Lamanites. Those who dissent from the Nephites are labeled then Lamanites, and that it becomes more of a cultural or
yeah.
believing designation versus
I think it was
lineage.
cultural starting with Jacob, but I think after the end of that 200 years of peace, when we're creating ites when there were no ites, I think that's when things become even more generic.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically, are you a member of the church or aren't you? And then, of course, at that time period, who's here? All of the Native American populations from South America up to North America, wherever you are, those are people who were remainder. And because it was no longer lineal or tribal, it was simply a generic thing.
Well,
And
something
yet
I
that
find
term
interesting,
applies all over.
yeah, in section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants, I remember finding this in the video I did on DNA, and it talks about like the Lord, telling, Joe Smith and the early brethren missionaries to go to the Lamanites, those that are Lamanites, and those I've written here that became Lamanites because of their dissensions. And it's almost like the Lord is saying that Lamanite isn't just for those who are literal blood descendants. It could be,
Yeah,
but also those who, because of unbelief or dissension, are labeled as Lamanite, almost making
sure.
it more broad in that sense. So I
Yeah.
want to transition to asking some of the criticisms that critics would bring up about the Lamanites. So you already touched on this, but they would say, well, the Lord seemed to identify the Native Americans, or the Lamanites, sorry, are the Native Americans in Missouri, and that's where the Lamanites are, that they are the literal descendants of the Lamanites, the Native Americans there, and that it's not referring to, all those throughout the Americas.
Yeah, and that criticism assumes that there has to be a lineal genetic connection, that
For
the
them to be
term
Lamanite.
has to have something that's connected to the people that are written about in the Book of Mormon, which ended at AD 400, that ballpark. And we don't discover them until over 1,000 years later. And so it's saying that these people up here must be related to the people that died off 1,000 years earlier. And that has to be the reason why we would say that these are exclusively Lamanite. Take the term Lamanite, and if we go back to Jacob and then go back to what I was saying about how it becomes even more generic with Mormon, uh, instead of Lamanite, say Gentile. Okay. So Joseph sent the missionaries to the Gentiles that were west of the Mississippi. Okay. Did he send them later send missionaries to Mexico, to the Gentiles in Mexico? Yep, sure. Yep. Once you realize that the term Lamanite and the term Gentile are essentially the same thing, that it's just this big conglomerate thing that says anybody who is not who is descended from these early people who has not accepted the gospel is a Lamanite. Once that's the definition of Lamanite, you go, you do what the church does, which is say everybody's Lamanite. You have prophets who talk to people in South America and call them Lamanites. You have
That's
people who go
right.
to Mexico. If the modern prophets are accepting this very expansive definition of Lamanite, why were you nitpicking with the thing? Well, we only nitpick because we try to uh, find something against the Book of Mormon, and we tend to find something against the Mormon based upon some very simplistic reading of the Book of Mormon that, frankly, the Book of Mormon itself does not support.
Right. Yeah. So you're saying the Book of Mormon itself does not support that the term or designation Lamanite is only for those who are literal blood descendants
No,
of
it
Laman
doesn't.
Lemuel. The Book of Mormon's more
No.
broad. You could even say that that revelation I read in Doctrine and Covenants 10 is more broad, and statements by past prophets, that we've
Yeah.
had as well, talking about all sort of people in the Americas, including like the Polynesian islands, being
Right.
these
Right.
Lamanites, whether or not they're blood
You know.
descendants of Laman
Yeah.
and Lemuel or not.
You could certainly, again, on the simplistic reading, you could say a layman has to be a descendant, but that's your reading. That isn't what the text says.
Yeah, it's
You
not
know,
a
you
careful.
dive into the way the text uses the terminology and how it develops, you can't support that argument. So you could certainly say so and assume so, but you're basing it on an assumptive reading rather than a very careful reading of the text. The text itself does not support that reading. The text itself says that this is a very generic thing. And the easiest thing to do is to just say, switch them in your mind and say Gentile.
Mhm.
Call it Western Hemisphere Gentile, yeah, and you get a better idea of what it is, and particularly how the church is using that terminology now. So that's what the church recognizes, and certainly I would hesitate to contradict them.
Yeah, because I suppose those people who would use those early revelations or statements from Joseph Smith and other leaders identifying the Native Americans or American Indians,
Yeah,
say in Missouri, that because Joseph identified them as these are the Lamanites, that this supports, Book of Mormon
yeah,
geography happening there. But then they also need to take into account the other statements from
yeah.
prophets who've identified all the people as Lamanites throughout
Right.
North.
And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems with that argument is that it says, what Joseph Smith said is true and it holds, but for some reason he never told anybody else. And all of the rest of the 12 and everybody who went to Utah and the 12 apostles and the organization of the church in Utah, for some reason they didn't hold to what Joseph Smith had said about the Lamanites. The Lamanites that Brigham Young dealt with were very different than the ones that Hiram Smith went to preach to. Um,
They had a
it's
more
completely
expansive
different
view.
tribes. They still
Right.
call them Lamanites, And if Joseph had said the only Lamanites are these, then Brigham and everybody else was wrong and they got it wrong that fast. I mean, it does not fit with history.
I remember Ugo Prego in our interview. He's obviously a geneticist and knows a lot more about DNA and population genetics than I do. But he sort of said to me that going back enough generations due to just like genetic mixing, that all Native Americans you could say could almost be considered as Lamanites, even if they're not blood literal descendants.
Yeah,
Going back enough generations and enough intermixing, even if there's no, say, trace of DNA. Now the question that kind of like one of the main criticisms, and I hear this a lot by critics or, John Dehlin on a podcast would say, the Book of Mormon, one of the primary purposes is it's written to convert the Lamanite as well as Jew and Gentile. And because of DNA, we can't identify who a Lamanite is. And this again probably comes back to your definition of Lamanite. So how would you answer the criticism that, well, then who are the Lamanites? Who are we then to convert and bring and convert to Christ and bring into the church?
Frankly, I think if I go back to Mormon and I say, if I were Mormon and I'm writing this, to whom am I writing? He's writing to a future generation. Who does Mormon know? He knows people around him. He knows people like him. I doubt that Mormon had a vision where he saw automobiles. He knew there were future populations, but I suspect he strongly understood that his future populations were people that he was used to, and the only people he was used to were the people in that area. Wherever you place the Book of Mormon, I mean, this one's, sort of not location specific. if you're talking about Mormon, who does he think a Lamanite is? Everybody that's left. And so he writes to the Lamanites, not knowing really that there's going to be people who consider themselves not Lamanites who would come.
Because there really wasn't any believers left other than some Moroni by this stage in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. So, although Mormon very explicitly writes to the Lamanites, I'm not considered a Lamanite. I don't consider myself a Lamanite. I wouldn't think of anybody who considers themselves a Lamanite who would think I was one. But I get to have the benefit of the Book of Mormon. I think Mormon wrote to me, even though he said Lamanites, because I think he was saying, look, I'm writing this to a future population. The only one I know is Lamanites. I'm going to write to the Lamanites, and I mean everybody. Oh, yeah, you guys that, trace your generations from Western Europe, yeah, you can have the Book of Mormon too. And in fact, in other revelations, we find out that, that some of the prophets understood at least that it would be, a Gentile who would bring it to the Lamanites. But yeah, we get the Book of Mormon. Even though Mormon wrote it to Lamanites, so I think Mormon was very inclusive, and not just Lamanites, but I suspect he would have included us as Lamanites because we weren't converted. I think we've redefined that as, again, people, native, indigenous people from before the European conquests. But yeah, I suspect that from Mormon's standpoint, he was writing to anybody in the future that would be able to read this book and get something from it.
Okay. Well, Brant, I think this has been quite a good discussion about does the Book of Mormon speak and allow for there being other peoples there when the Nephites and Lamanites and also the Jaredites arrive, and discussing the implicit references that you might see in the text, responding to some of the things that critics would argue, and then also talking about like who are the Lamanites as well. I think this could be a good place to stop for part one. We could take maybe a very short break, and then for part two, we're going to have a bit of a chat and discussion about a very controversial topic, racism in the Book of Mormon, and the different views or theories that there are for what does it mean when the Lamanites are cursed with a skin of blackness as well. So thanks so much for watching, everyone. Part one, if you've enjoyed it, comment, like, share this video. If you have any questions or any pushbacks to any things that Brant said, write them underneath as well. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on part two. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.